Warning: the following story contains graphic descriptions of violence, mental illness, and murder. I used to think the world was a cruel place, but now I understand it's merely indifferent. I learned that lesson in the most intimate way possible, as I descended into a madness that wasn't even my own, but was forced upon me by the hand of another, a hand that slashed through the very fabric of reality itself. They called him Mr. Nightmare. A phantom, they said, a shadow in the dark that preyed on the weak and the wicked alike. At least, that's what they said when they found the first bodies. I wasn't weak, but I wasn't wicked either. No, I was something far worse. I was ordinary until the day I met him. It started with the rumors, whispers in the school hallways about the disappearances. Students vanished, their bodies found days later, gutted like animals. But the police, those fools, said it was the work of a random lunatic, a drifter passing through town. They didn't know about the patterns, the way each victim was chosen. They didn't know about Mr. Nightmare, but I did. I knew from the moment he started watching me. You see, I was bullied relentlessly. Every single day. The jocks, the popular kids, they saw me as nothing, just a freak to torment for their sick amusement. And I let them. I let them push me, shove me, break me down, until I was nothing but a hollow shell, moving through life with no purpose, no joy, no hope. That's when the nightmares began. It was subtle at first, shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers in the dark that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't real, but the more I ignored it, the more persistent it became. Until one night, I saw him, Mr. Nightmare. He stood at the foot of my bed, tall, imposing, his face hidden in the darkness. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, cold, piercing, filled with a malevolence that made my blood run cold. He didn't speak, but I heard his voice inside my head, a low, guttural growl that filled me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever known. He told me what he was going to do. Not just to me, but to them, the bullies, the tormentors, the ones who made my life a living hell. He said they deserved it, that they had it coming. And as much as I wanted to deny it, to fight back against the madness, a part of me, deep down, in the darkest recesses of my mind, agreed with him. The first to go was Jake, the leader of the pack. I found him the next day, or rather, what was left of him. His body was strung up in the gymnasium, his insides on the outside, his face frozen in a grotesque mask of terror. The others screamed, ran, but I stood there, staring at the horror before me. Feeling nothing. No, that's not true. I felt something. Satisfaction. They tried to cover it up, of course, said it was a tragic accident, a freak occurrence. But I knew better. Mr. Nightmare had come, and he wasn't done. The others followed soon after, one by one, each death more gruesome than the last. Sam, the one who loved to humiliate me in front of the whole school, was found in his own locker, his throat slit from ear to ear. Lisa, who made it her mission to spread lies and rumors about me, was discovered in the girls' bathroom, her tongue torn out and nailed to the wall. The school went into lockdown, the police patrolling the halls, but it didn't matter. Mr. Nightmare was unstoppable. A force of nature that no one could contain. And as the body count rose, so did the whispers, the fear. The students, the teachers, they all looked at me differently now. Not with pity, but with fear. They knew, but what they didn't know was that I was no longer afraid. Because I wasn't just the victim anymore, I was his accomplice. He came to me every night, whispering his plans, showing me the faces of those who would die next. And I reveled in it. The power, the control, the sweet, sweet revenge. They deserved it, all of them. And I was the one delivering their judgment. But as the days went on, something changed. The nightmares, they became more intense, more real. I started seeing him during the day, in the mirrors, in the reflections of windows, in the eyes of those around me. He was everywhere, and he was inside me. The final straw came when he showed me my own face, twisted, contorted, covered in blood. It wasn't a vision, it was a promise that my time was coming, and now, as I sit here, alone in the darkness, I know what I have to do. There's only one way to stop him, to end this madness once and for all. But as I hold the knife in my hand, feeling its cold, sharp edge against my skin, I can't help but wonder, is this really the end? Or is this just the beginning? Because deep down, I know the truth. I am Mr. Nightmare. I thought plunging the knife into my own flesh would be the end. A way to escape the nightmare that had become my reality. But as the blade bit into my skin, cold steel slicing through muscle and tendon, I didn't feel the release I had hoped for. Instead, I felt something else, something far worse. I felt him. Mr. Nightmare was inside me, a shadowy presence coiled around my mind like a venomous snake, squeezing tighter with every beat of my heart. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped me as I realized what was happening. I wasn't ending the nightmare. I was becoming it, my vision blurred. Darkness creeping in at the edges as I collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around me in a growing stain. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but all that came out was a low, guttural growl, a sound that wasn't entirely mine. I don't know how long I lay there, teetering on the edge of consciousness, but when I finally opened my eyes, the world was different. Everything was sharper, clearer, as if a veil had been lifted. The shadows that had once haunted me were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I was no longer just a victim. I was a predator. The knife was still in my hand, its blade slick with my own blood, but the pain had dulled to a distant throb. I stood up, the world tilting slightly as I adjusted to this new reality, this new me. There was no fear now, no doubt. Only purpose. I walked out of my room, the house eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The hallway stretched out before me, long and narrow, the walls lined with photos of a life that no longer felt like mine. I reached out, brushing my fingers against the glass of a framed picture, my parents, smiling, happy, clueless. They were out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone in this empty house. Alone, except for him, Mr. Nightmare's voice whispered in my mind. A dark, insidious presence that guided my every step, my every thought. He showed me what I needed to do, who I needed to find, and how I needed to kill them. And I obeyed, without question, without hesitation. The first stop was the school. It was late, long after the final bell had rung, but I knew there would still be people there. People who had wronged me. People who deserved to die. The halls were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering as if they, too, were afraid of what was coming. I moved through the shadows, silent, invisible, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. I knew exactly where to find them. Mr. Nightmare had shown me. The janitor's closet was tucked away in a corner of the school. A small, claustrophobic space that reeked of bleach and despair. I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. Inside, crouched on the floor, was Peter, the school's janitor. He was hunched over, his back to me, muttering to himself as he cleaned up a spill. He didn't hear me approach. He didn't hear me at all. The first stab was quick, precise, the knife plunging into the back of his neck with a sickening squelch. His body jerked, spasming as he tried to scream, but all that came out was a gurgling choke. I twisted the blade, feeling the life drain out of him as his blood sprayed across the walls, pooling at my feet. There was no satisfaction, no pleasure, only a cold, detached calm. This was necessary. This was justice. I yanked the knife out, Peter's body collapsing to the floor in a lifeless heap. Blood seeped into the cracks of the tile, the metallic scent filling the small room. I stood over him for a moment, watching the light fade from his eyes before turning and leaving, the door swinging shut behind me. One down, the next target was closer to home, Mrs. Reynolds, my neighbor. She was always so kind, always so concerned, always asking if I was okay. But I saw through her fake smiles, her empty words. She was just like the rest of them, pretending to care while secretly relishing in my misery. I found her in her garden, tending to her flowers in the fading light of the evening. She didn't see me coming, too focused on pruning her roses, her back turned to me. I stood there, watching her for a moment, the knife held loosely at my side. Then, without a word, I struck. The blade sank into her back, and she let out a sharp, strangled cry, stumbling forward as she tried to escape. But there was nowhere to go. I grabbed her by the hair, pulling her back towards me as I slashed at her throat, the knife carving through flesh and bone with brutal efficiency. Blood sprayed across the garden, staining the petals of her precious roses a deep crimson. She collapsed to the ground, her hands clawing at her throat, trying in vain to stop the bleeding. I watched her struggle, her eyes wide with terror, until finally, she went still. Two down. The voices in my head grew louder, more insistent, urging me on, pushing me to continue. The knife was an extension of my will, an instrument of vengeance that I wielded with cold precision. The world had wronged me, but now it was my turn to strike back. I moved through the night like a shadow, silent, deadly, leaving a trail of blood and death in my wake. Each kill was quick, brutal, a testament to the rage that had been festering inside me for so long. I wasn't just getting even, I was reclaiming my power, my control. The final target was a familiar one, my tormentor, the one who had started it all. Mike. The boy who had made it his mission to break me, to turn my life into a living hell. I found him in his room, gaming, completely oblivious to the world around him. The screen's light flickered across his face, casting eerie shadows that danced in his eyes. I watched him for a moment, the memories of all the pain, all the humiliation, flooding back. The way he used to shove me into lockers. The way he laughed as I struggled to hold back tears, the way he looked at me like I was nothing, not anymore. The knife felt heavy in my hand, the weight of all that I had done pressing down on me. But I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I stepped forward, my movements quick, precise, the blade flashing in the dim light as I brought it down on him. Mike didn't even have time to scream. I stabbed him again and again, each thrust fueled by years of pent-up rage, of hatred that had finally found its release. Blood splattered across the room, the walls, the floor, the bed, as I carved into him, each slash a punishment for every insult, every shove, every sneer. By the time I was done, he was unrecognizable, a mangled mess of flesh and bone, a grotesque sculpture of my revenge. I stood there, breathing heavily, the knife still clenched in my hand, blood dripping from the blade. It was over, but as I looked at the carnage around me, the reality of what I had done began to sink in. The voices in my head grew quieter, their whispers fading into the background as the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. I had become the monster they always said I was. The freak, the psycho, the killer. I had proven them right, and now, there was nothing left. I turned away from the body, the knife slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. I walked out of the room, out of the house, into the night. The world was silent, the shadows deep and dark, swallowing me whole as I disappeared into them. The nightmares would never end. I knew that now. Because I wasn't just running from them anymore, I was part of them. I was Mr. Nightmare, and he was here to stay. The streets were empty, bathed in a sickly yellow light from the flickering street lamps. I moved through them like a ghost, unnoticed, unseen. The knife was gone, left behind in Mike's blood-soaked room, but it didn't matter. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need anything. I was Mr. Nightmare now, and the darkness was my home, but as I walked, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It wasn't fear, or guilt, or even the cold emptiness that had filled me after the last kill. It was something else, something that twisted and coiled inside me like a parasite, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It was anticipation. The world around me seemed to warp and bend, the shadows deepening, stretching out like claws, reaching for me. I felt them brush against my skin, cold and clammy, sending shivers down my spine. The air grew thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe, each step a struggle as if the ground itself was trying to pull me under. And then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Echoing through the empty streets, getting closer with every passing second. They weren't mine, someone was following me. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see some faceless figure emerging from the darkness, another victim drawn to the monster I had become. But there was no one. The street was empty, silent, the shadows still, as if holding their breath. Yet, the footsteps continued, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just following me, they were chasing me. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp, cutting through the numbness that had settled in my mind. I started to run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tore through the streets, my footsteps echoing in the silence, mingling with the relentless pursuit behind me. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps stayed with me, always just a few steps behind, taunting me, driving me forward. The world around me blurred, the buildings and streets blending into a dizzying whirl of darkness and light. I could feel something closing in, something terrible, something that wanted to drag me back into the nightmare. I stumbled, nearly falling as I rounded a corner, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. The alley was narrow, suffocating, the walls closing in on me as I tried to catch my breath. The shadows creeping closer, hungry, eager to consume me. And then, out of the darkness, he appeared, Mr. Nightmare. He was different this time, more real, more tangible, as if he had stepped out of my mind and into the physical world. His form was shadowy, indistinct, but his eyes, those cold, dead eyes, shone with a terrifying clarity, pinning me in place. "You can't run from me," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the alley, sending tremors through my body. "You are me." I wanted to deny it, to scream that he was wrong, that I was still me, still human. But the words caught in my throat, choked by the weight of the truth. I wasn't human anymore. I was something else, something darker, something twisted and broken beyond repair. Mr. Nightmare stepped closer, his presence suffocating, the air thickening with a palpable malice that pressed down on me, crushing my chest, making it hard to breathe. The walls of the alley seemed to close in, the shadows writhing and shifting, alive with a malevolent intent. "You embraced me," he continued, his voice softer now, almost soothing, like a lullaby sung to a dying child. "You let me in. And now, you can never let me go." I backed away, my heart racing, my mind screaming for me to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The alley was a dead end, the walls closing in on all sides, trapping me in this hellish embrace. Mr. Nightmare reached out, his hand a dark, twisted thing, fingers like claws, sharp and jagged. He touched my face, his touch cold, searing, burning into my skin, branding me as his own. I wanted to pull away, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in this waking nightmare, helpless. "You are me," he whispered again, his voice a deadly caress, sliding into my mind like a blade, slicing through the last vestiges of my sanity. "And I am you." The world around me blurred, darkness swallowing the light, the walls of the alley closing in until there was nothing left but him, Mr. Nightmare, and the endless, suffocating void. I could feel him inside me, in my thoughts, in my veins, in every beat of my heart. He was right. We were one. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer, the force of it knocking the breath out of my lungs, sending me crashing to my knees. The pain was unbearable, a a searing agony that ripped through my mind, my soul, as the last remnants of my humanity were torn away, leaving only the darkness, only him. Mr. Nightmare smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that sent a shiver of terror through me. But there was no escape now. No way out. I was his, and he was mine. The darkness closed in, swallowing us both, the world disappearing into a void of endless night. And in that moment, I knew the truth. The nightmare had never ended, it had only just begun. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the town. The streets were quiet, the echoes of last night's horrors still lingering in the air, heavy, oppressive. The police were out in force, cordoning off sections, yellow tape fluttering in the gentle breeze. They would find the bodies soon enough. Peter, the janitor, lifeless in his closet, his blood staining the walls. Mrs. Reynolds, sprawled in her garden, her throat a ragged, gaping wound. Mike, unrecognizable, his room a butcher's shop of carnage. And then, they would find me. They would find the alley, dark and narrow, the shadows hiding the truth from the light. They would see my body, broken, lifeless, my face twisted in a grotesque mask of terror. They would wonder what had happened, who had done this, how I had met such a gruesome end, but they would never know that I wasn't just a victim, that I was something more. Something darker. Something that had transcended the boundaries of life and death. Of reality and nightmare, because Mr. Nightmare wasn't just a killer, wasn't just a figment of imagination, he was real. He was alive, and now, he was free. The town would never be the same. The darkness had come, and it wasn't going to leave. Not now. Not ever, because when the shadows call, you can't ignore them. You can't hide from them, and you can't escape them. Mr. Nightmare is here, and he's here to stay. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the town as if the very light itself was afraid to linger. The streets, once bustling with life, now felt desolate, the silence thick with unspoken dread. The news had spread fast, 3 more bodies found. Each more horrific than the last. The town was on edge, every eye searching the darkness for the phantom killer who had turned their world into a nightmare, but they couldn't see him. Not really. Because Mr. Nightmare wasn't just a man. He was the darkness itself, the creeping terror that slithered through the streets, hiding in every corner, lurking in every shadow. And now, he was everywhere. I watched from the sidelines, a ghost in the world I once knew, my body abandoned in that narrow alley, my mind tethered to something far darker, far more powerful. I was no longer confined by flesh and bone, no longer limited by the boundaries of life and death. I had transcended, become something more, something infinite. I was Mr. Nightmare, and the town, my town, was mine to torment. The police were clueless, fumbling in the dark, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the thickening night. They searched the streets, the alleyways, the abandoned buildings, hoping to find some clue, some trace of the killer. But they would find nothing. Because I was nowhere, and everywhere, I drifted through the town like a shadow, my presence felt but never seen, a cold whisper in the back of every mind, a shiver down every spine. The fear was intoxicating. A heady mix of terror and anticipation that pulsed through the air, feeding me, fueling me. I could feel the town's collective heartbeat, fast and frantic, pounding in unison with mine. We were connected now, bound together by the darkness that had enveloped us all, and I wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing I had to do, one more life I had to take before I could truly claim this town as my own. I found her in her home, the lights dim, the curtains drawn, as if she could keep the darkness at bay by simply shutting it out. Sarah. My mother. She was sitting on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a photo frame, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I could see the exhaustion in her face. The lines of worry etched deep into her skin, the fear that clung to her like a second skin. She had heard about the murders, of course. The whole town had. But she didn't know that her son was the one responsible. She didn't know that the boy she had raised, the boy she had loved, was gone, replaced by the monster that now stood in her living room. She didn't see me as I approached, my steps silent, my form nothing more than a wisp of shadow. But she felt me. I saw it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way her breath hitched, the way her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, someone, that wasn't there. "Dinsy," she whispered, her voice cracking, breaking under the weight of her fear. "Please, if you're out there, please come home." I stopped, standing just a few feet from her, the darkness swirling around me, coiling, tightening, preparing for the final strike. But something held me back, something deep inside that resisted the urge, the compulsion to end her life. I could feel Mr. Nightmare, his presence, his will, pushing me forward, urging me to finish what I had started, to complete the transformation, but I hesitated. "Please," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with the force of her grief. "Please don't leave me. Not you too." The knife appeared in my hand, solid, real, a blade of pure darkness that pulsed with the same malevolent energy that had consumed me. I raised it, my movement slow, deliberate, the final act of a tragedy that had played out long before either of us realized it. This was my destiny, my purpose. This was what Mr. Nightmare demanded, but as I stood there, the knife poised to strike, something shifted inside me. A memory, buried deep, fought its way to the surface, a memory of warmth, of love, of a time before the darkness had taken hold. I remembered her smile, her laughter, the way she used to hold me when the world seemed too big, too scary. And for a moment, just a moment, I wasn't Mr. Nightmare anymore, I was her son. The knife trembled in my hand, the darkness recoiling, retreating as that memory, that light, flickered in the depths of my mind. I could feel the grip of Mr. Nightmare weakening, his influence slipping as I clung to that memory, that piece of myself that had somehow survived. I could end it, I realized. I could let go, let her live, let the town recover. I could take the darkness with me, bury it deep where it could never hurt anyone again. I could choose to be human again, to fight against the nightmare, to reclaim what was left of my soul. But then, as I hesitated, I felt something else, a presence, cold and familiar, wrapping around me like a vice, squeezing tighter, crushing that flicker of light. It was Mr. Nightmare. And he wasn't ready to let me go. "No," he whispered, his voice slithering through my mind like poison, wrapping around that memory, that light, and snuffing it out. "You are mine. Forever." I felt myself slipping, the darkness closing in, swallowing that last shred of humanity, pulling me back into the abyss. The knife steadied in my hand, the hesitation gone, replaced by cold, unfeeling certainty. I was Mr. Nightmare, and I had a job to do. But just as I moved to strike, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine, not the eyes of a killer, but the eyes of her son. And in that moment, something broke inside me. The knife fell from my hand, clattering to the floor, the sound loud, deafening in the silence. I staggered back, the darkness recoiling, the shadows slipping away, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, human. "Mom." I whispered, my voice hoarse, broken, the sound of it foreign, unfamiliar. I could see the confusion, the fear in her eyes as she looked at me, trying to reconcile the boy she knew with the monster that stood before her, but she didn't scream. She didn't run. Instead, she reached out, her hand trembling, tentative, as if afraid I might disappear if she touched me. But I didn't move, didn't flinch. As her fingers brushed against my cheek, warm and soft, real, "Dinsy," she whispered, her voice filled with a hope that I didn't deserve, a love that I couldn't comprehend. "You're still here." I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that I could still be saved, that there was still a part of me that wasn't lost to the darkness. But as I stood there, feeling her touch, her warmth, I knew the truth. I wasn't her son anymore. The darkness hadn't left. It had just gone deeper, burrowed into the very core of my being, waiting, watching, biding its time. I could feel it there, a constant presence, a shadow that I could never escape, never outrun. Mr. Nightmare wasn't gone. He was inside me, a part of me, and he would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when I would falter, when I would lose control. And when that moment came, when the darkness finally consumed me, there would be no stopping him. The town would never be safe. No one would ever be safe, because the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. I pulled away from her, the warmth of her touch fading as I stepped back into the shadows. The darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. I could see the confusion, the hurt in her eyes as I turned away, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't let her see what I had become, what I would become again. Dinsy, please. She cried, but I was already gone, swallowed by the night, the shadows closing in around me. I walked through the empty streets, the town silent, still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The darkness clung to me, a constant reminder of what I had done, what I had lost, and as I disappeared into the night, I knew there was no escape, no redemption. The nightmare would continue, and when the time came, I would embrace it once more, because Mr. Nightmare was here to stay, and so was I. The town would wake the next morning, unaware of the monster that walked among them, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. They would go about their lives, oblivious, blind to the danger that stalked them. But I would know, and I would wait, because when the shadows call, they call for blood. And Mr. Nightmare always answers, and so would I. Somewhere, in the quiet of the night, a shadow moved, slipping through the darkness, unseen, unheard. It was a presence, a whisper in the wind, a promise of terror yet to come. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, as I moved through the town's outskirts, the familiar weight of Mr. Nightmare settling back into place. It was like a second skin, tight, suffocating, but comforting in its own way. I could feel him in my thoughts, whispering, urging me forward, reminding me that the nightmare wasn't over. It never would be. The town was quiet, but not peaceful. The tension hung in the air, palpable, a collective unease that seemed to vibrate through the streets. People were on edge, their nerves frayed, their senses heightened. They knew something was wrong, something beyond their comprehension, something lurking just out of sight, but they didn't know it was me. Not yet. I kept to the shadows, moving silently, invisibly, the darkness my only companion. The night was cold, a sharp wind cutting through the air, carrying with it the scent of rain. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy, pregnant with the promise of a storm. It felt fitting, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the chaos to begin, and it would begin soon. I could feel it building inside me, a pressure, a need that clawed at my insides, desperate to be unleashed. Mr. Nightmare was patient, but only just. He was hungry, ravenous, and he wouldn't wait much longer. I found myself drawn to the outskirts of town, to the place where the trees grew thick and the shadows were darkest. It was a place I knew well, a place I had once gone to escape the world, to find solace in the silence. Now, it was a place that called to me, beckoning me deeper into the night, into the heart of the darkness. The woods were dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grasp at me as I passed. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thick, but I moved through it with ease, as if I had walked this path 1,000 times before. Maybe I had. The farther I went, the quieter it became, the sounds of the town fading away, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant call of some unseen creature. The world felt distant, unreal, as if I had stepped out of one reality and into another, a darker, more twisted version of the life I once knew. And then, I saw it, a cabin, hidden deep within the woods, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. It was old, the wood weathered and rotting, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. But there was something about it. Something that pulled me in, that whispered to me, promising things that I couldn't ignore. I approached slowly, cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, the anticipation building with every step. The darkness around me seemed to thicken, pressing in on me, suffocating, but I welcomed it, embraced it. This was where I belonged. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight, the air thick with the scent of decay, of rot and mildew. The cabin was small, just one room, with a single window that let in a sliver of the dying light. The furniture was sparse, a chair overturned in the corner, a table covered in dust, a bed that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years, and in the center of the room there was a mirror. It was old, the glass cracked and cloudy, the frame covered in a thick layer of dust. But as I approached it, something about it drew me in, compelled me to look closer. I wiped away the dust with a trembling hand, revealing my reflection, or what was left of it. It wasn't just me staring back. I could see him there, just behind my eyes, lurking in the shadows of my mind. Mr. Nightmare. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating, but I couldn't look away. The reflection shifted, twisted, becoming something darker, more grotesque. My face was a mask of terror, my eyes wide, empty, hollow. And behind me, in the reflection, I could see the cabin, but it was different. Bloodstains on the walls, shadows moving in the corners, something dark and twisted writhing just out of sight. I could feel it now, the darkness seeping into me, into my very soul. It was consuming me, taking over, and I was powerless to stop it. The nightmare was inside me, and it was growing, feeding on my fear, my anger, my despair. I reached out to touch the mirror, my fingers brushing against the cold, cracked glass. The reflection shuddered, rippling like water, and suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. He was there, standing just behind me. His presence a cold, terrifying weight that pressed down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. I could see him clearly now, his face a twisted parody of mine, his eyes dark and empty, his smile cruel, malevolent. "Welcome home," he whispered, his voice like nails on a chalkboard, scraping against my mind, tearing at my sanity. I tried to pull away, to break free, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen in place, trapped in the reflection. He moved closer, his hand reaching out to touch my shoulder, and I felt a jolt of icy cold run through me, paralyzing me, binding me to him. "You can't fight it," he said, his voice a sickening, seductive purr. "You can't escape. You're mine now." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in his web, ensnared by the darkness that he had brought into my life. And deep down, I knew he was right, there was no escape. But then, something changed. The reflection in the mirror began to shift, to warp, the glass rippling like water once more. I watched in horror as the cabin around me seemed to dissolve, melting away into a sea of darkness, leaving me standing alone in the void, with only him for company. But I wasn't alone for long. Out of the darkness, figures began to emerge, twisted, grotesque shapes that writhed and slithered, their forms barely human. They surrounded me, their eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light, their mouths twisting into cruel, mocking smiles. I could hear them whispering, their voices overlapping, a cacophony of madness that filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts, my will. They were the souls of the people I had killed, Peter, Mrs. Reynolds, Mike, all of them were there, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes accusing, condemning. They reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy, their touch burning like acid on my skin. I could feel their pain, their terror, their hatred. And it overwhelmed me, consuming me. I wanted to fight, to break free, but the darkness was too strong, too powerful. It swallowed me whole, pulling me down into the abyss, into the heart of the nightmare. I could feel myself slipping away, losing myself to the void, to the darkness that had become my world. But just as I was about to succumb, just as the last vestiges of my sanity were about to be torn away, I heard a voice that cut through the darkness like a knife, sharp and clear, filled with a warmth that I had thought was lost forever. "Dinsy," it whispered, soft, gentle, filled with love and sorrow. "Come back to me." It was my mother. Her voice was like a beacon. A light in the darkness, guiding me back, pulling me away from the edge. I could feel the darkness recoiling, retreating, as her voice grew stronger, more insistent, more real. "You're stronger than this," she said, her voice filled with determination, with hope. "You can fight it. You can come back." I clung to her words, to the sound of her voice, using it to pull myself out of the darkness, out of the nightmare. The figures around me began to fade, their voices growing weaker, more distant, until they were nothing but echoes, whispers in the void. And then, the darkness was gone. I was standing in the cabin again, the mirror in front of me, but the reflection was different now. It was just me, no shadows, no monsters, no Mr. Nightmare. Just me. I looked around the cabin, the reality of it sinking in, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I could still feel the darkness inside me, lurking, waiting, but it was weaker now, diminished. I had fought it off, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. The nightmare would return. It would always return. But for now, I was in control. For now, I was free. I turned away from the mirror, the cabin, the darkness, and walked out into the night. The storm had arrived, rain pouring down in sheets, thunder rumbling in the distance. The town lay ahead, quiet, still, unaware of the battle that had just taken place. I knew I couldn't stay. Not here. Not anywhere. Not as long as Mr. Nightmare was still inside me, still waiting, still hungry, but I would fight him. I would keep fighting, as long as it took, until the darkness was gone for good, or until it consumed me completely. As I disappeared into the night, the storm raging around me, I couldn't help but wonder how long I had left. How long I could keep him at bay. How long before the nightmare took over again. But one thing was certain, when the shadows called again, I would be ready, or I would be lost. The rain fell in torrents, drenching me as I wandered aimlessly through the town's outskirts. My thoughts a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and a lingering dread that gnawed at my sanity. The battle inside me was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. The darkness had retreated, but it wasn't gone. It was biding its time, waiting for the moment when I would weaken, when I would falter, and then it would strike again. I couldn't stay here. Not with the constant threat of Mr. Nightmare lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to take control. But where could I go? There was no escaping the darkness, no outrunning the shadow that had become a part of me. It would follow me wherever I went, a relentless, insidious presence that I could never truly be free of. I found myself drawn back to the heart of the town, the familiar streets now deserted, the buildings dark, empty. The storm had driven everyone indoors, seeking shelter from the deluge. But I had no such refuge. The only place I could go was deeper into the darkness, into the nightmare that awaited me. As I walked, the memories of the night before played out in my mind in vivid, gruesome detail. The murders, the blood, the terror in their eyes as they realized what was coming for them. It was all still there, etched into my soul. A constant reminder of the monster I had become. The darkness whispered to me, coaxing, tempting, urging me to embrace it once more. It would be so easy to give in, to let Mr. Nightmare take control, to lose myself in the madness, in the bloodlust, but I couldn't. Not yet. The town was quiet, unnervingly so, as I approached the old, abandoned church at the edge of town. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, a place I had once gone to for solace, for answers. Now, it felt like the only place where I could find some semblance of peace, even if it was fleeting. The doors creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the empty nave. The air was thick with dust, the smell of mildew and decay permeating every corner. The stained glass windows were cracked, broken, the colorful depictions of saints and angels distorted, twisted into grotesque parodies by the passing of time. I moved down the aisle, the darkness inside me growing restless, impatient. It didn't like this place, this symbol of light, of hope. It wanted to leave, to escape, to find somewhere darker, somewhere it could thrive. But I wouldn't let it. Not here. I reached the altar and knelt before it, my hands shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was doing, what I was hoping to achieve by coming here. There were no answers, no salvation, no escape from the nightmare that had taken root in my soul. But I had to try. I had to believe that there was still a part of me that could be saved, a part of me that could fight back. But as I knelt there, the darkness began to creep back in, stronger, more insistent. The memories flooded my mind, the images of blood and violence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel it taking hold, sinking its claws into me, pulling me back into the abyss. And then, I heard it, a soft, distant sound, barely audible over the rain. A whisper, a voice, calling to me from the darkness. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. More distinct, until it was all I could hear. Dinsy. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was her voice. My mother's voice. But it wasn't the comforting, loving tone I had heard before. No, this was different. It was cold, hollow, filled with something dark, something wrong. Dinsy, come home. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkened church, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. No one. Just shadows, empty pews, and the remnants of the storm outside, but I could still hear her, calling to me, beckoning me to come closer, to step into the shadows. I knew it wasn't real, that it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, trying to lure me back into its grip. But the pull was strong, almost irresistible. Come to me, Dinsy. I took a step back, shaking my head, trying to block out the voice, to drown it out with my own thoughts. But it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too pervasive. It was everywhere, in everything, and it was winning. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, my heart racing. I had to get out, had to escape before it was too late. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, something in the corner of the church, hidden in the shadows, a figure. It was barely visible, just a dark silhouette against the cracked, faded walls. But I could feel its presence, feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling, weak. But there was no response, just the sound of the rain pounding against the roof, the wind howling through the broken windows. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat, the darkness inside me churning, restless. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, silent, still, and then, as I reached the edge of the light, I saw it. It was her. My mother. But not as I remembered her. This was a twisted, grotesque version of her, her face pale, hollow, her eyes dark, empty. Her body was thin, emaciated, her clothes tattered, soaked through with rain. She looked like a ghost, a wraith, something pulled from the depths of a nightmare, and when she spoke, her voice was like nails on a chalkboard, grating, harsh, filled with malice. Dinsy, you can't escape me. I stumbled back, fear gripping me, choking me. This wasn't my mother. This was something else, something darker, something born of the nightmare that had consumed my life. You belong to me now, she hissed, stepping closer, her movements jerky, unnatural. You will never be free. You will never escape. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away from her, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness was too strong. Too overwhelming. It had me in its grip, and it wasn't letting go, and then, she reached out, her hand cold, clammy, her touch like ice on my skin. I felt a jolt of pain, sharp, searing, as if her very touch was burning me, branding me. "You are mine, Dinsy," she whispered, her voice a sickening, seductive purr. "Forever." I tried to pull away, to break free, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong, too powerful. It had me, and it was pulling me down, deeper into the abyss, into the heart of the nightmare, and then, everything went black. I sat up, my head spinning, my body aching. The darkness was still there, still lurking, but it was quiet now, subdued. For now, but as I looked around the empty church, the memories of what had just happened began to flood back, the terror, the pain, the fear. And I realized that the nightmare wasn't over. It would never be over, because the darkness wasn't just inside me. It was everywhere, in everything, a constant, insidious presence that would never leave me, never let me go. I was Mr. Nightmare, and I always would be. Underscore 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 underscore. I left the church, the storm still raging, the town still silent, still unaware of the horror that lurked just beneath the surface. I walked through the streets, the rain washing over me, cleansing me, but it did nothing to wash away the darkness, the guilt, the fear. I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't risk the darkness taking over again, couldn't risk losing control and letting Mr. Nightmare loose on the town. I had to leave, had to go somewhere where I couldn't hurt anyone, where I couldn't be a danger to the people I loved. But as I walked, as the storm raged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late, that the darkness had already won, and as I disappeared into the night, I knew one thing for certain, the nightmare was far from over.